In the darkest hours of night, when slumber claims all but the restless few, there are those who dare to dream beyond the veil of sleep. For those who seek adventure, we spin tales that will take you on journeys across vast oceans, through mystical forests, and to lands untouched by modern eyes. Welcome to our channel, where the veil between reality and fantasy grows thin. If you are not yet subscribed, then do so now, lest you miss out on future adventures. Today's story is Chapter 1, Setting Sail into the Unknown. The year is 1492. For 5 centuries, men have dreamed of reaching Asia by sailing west across an ocean bigger than any they had ever seen. But many were also certain that if you sailed far enough west, you would eventually reach land. Some believed it was India or China, while others thought they would find gold and riches beyond their wildest dreams. You might even hear that the famed Marco Polo had traveled east to the court of Kublai Khan, returning to Venice with tales of a great Khan and wondrous cities made of precious metals. But there were others who believed that land lay further west, beyond the setting sun. One such man was Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic politician and writer. He lived in a world filled with legends of mighty heroes, mythical beasts and far-off lands. Those tales would become known as the Norse Sagas, stories passed down for generations by word of mouth until someone finally wrote them down. They contain some of the greatest tales of heroism, adventure, and tragedy ever told. But for our purposes, let's talk about one particular story. It's the tale of a hero named Leif Erikson, a man so adventurous he sailed across the sea to a land far away from the cold north, where winter barely existed. In fact, the land was filled with lush vineyards and wild grapes growing ripe and ready to pick. This was a place without snow, where men could farm the soil and hunt animals that had never before been seen in Europe. Leif called this Vinland, the land of plenty. And if you ask most people today, that's likely as much as they know about Vinland. It sounds like a nice place to live, but no one can agree whether it ever really existed. After all, no maps show any sign of this mysterious land. There are no artifacts or documents to prove that anyone else knew of its existence. But Snorri wasn't done telling the story. He went on to say that Leif returned home with 5 ships full of goods from Vinland, including timber that was unlike any he had ever seen, along with fertile soil and grapevines that grew well in Iceland. From Snorri's writings, we get the impression that Vinland was somewhere very far away, perhaps halfway across the ocean. Sometime later, another hero named Erik the Red murdered a rival and fled to Iceland. With him were his wife and son, Leif Erikson, the same Leif who discovered Vinland. Maybe the apple didn't fall far from the tree after all. Erik quickly learned that farming was more difficult in Iceland than he had imagined. So he convinced his son to sail back to Vinland to gather soil from the fields there, soil that would grow plants easily in Iceland. Leif set sail with 3 ships and arrived at Vinland. He spent the summer gathering plants and timber, but when autumn approached, he and his crew prepared to leave. As the first snow began to fall, they abandoned ship and settled in for the winter, living off the land until spring. And when the weather finally cleared, only 1 ship was left intact. So they divided the goods between the 2 remaining ships and set sail for home. They sailed for 10 days until they spotted land, but when they beached the boats and stepped onto the shore, they found it barren and lifeless. Desperate for fresh water, they built a fire and waited for it to rain. But no rain came, and they almost died of thirst. Only when they reached a nearby river did they quench their thirst and survive. Then they turned around and left. Erik the Red would go on to establish the first permanent settlement in Greenland. But neither he nor any of his descendants ever spoke of Vinland again. So did Vinland really exist? Was it real or just a figment of Snorri's imagination? Well, here's the thing. No one knows for sure, but many historians believe that Vinland did exist and that the Norse people actually visited North America about 500 years before Christopher Columbus. In fact, many believe that the Norse established a settlement in Newfoundland, Canada, around the year 1000 AD. The theory goes that this settlement thrived for a time, but was eventually abandoned due to dwindling populations and competition with the Inuit people who already lived there. Archaeologists have uncovered several pieces of evidence that support this theory, including a runestone known as the Meadows inscription. It was discovered in 1960 and contains Old Norse runes that translate to here. King Olver and his companions stayed. King Olver is believed to be the same Olver who sailed with Erik the Red to Greenland. There are also other pieces of evidence that seem to confirm the Vinland story, like a fragment of a Norse poem that mentions hunting walruses and other animals unknown in Europe. There are also tales from the time period of fierce battles fought with the natives over territory and resources, and there are other tales of trade between the Norse and the native peoples. But for every piece of evidence there are questions. For example, the poem fragment comes from a manuscript written about 300 years after Eric the Red's supposed voyage, making it possible that the story was embellished or entirely fabricated. And the Lons o Meadows inscription has been heavily debated by scholars, with some arguing that the runes aren't actually Old Norse at all. As for the other evidence, well, no one has ever been able to prove it definitively. Still, the possibility that the Norse explored and settled in North America long before Columbus remains an intriguing idea. So, which brings us to our story today. Let's imagine that Snorri Sturluson was right. Leif Erikson really did sail to Vinland, a place so different from Iceland that its people had no word for snow. Let's imagine that the Norse settled in Vinland and built a small community of farms and homes, raising livestock and growing crops. And let us imagine that they lived in peace with the native peoples, until one day a terrible plague swept through the settlement, killing nearly everyone. With no one left to carry on the Norse culture, their farms were abandoned and their houses fell into disrepair. What happened to Vinland after that? Did the native people return to the area, or did they abandon it and move elsewhere? What happened to the Norse who fled to Greenland? And what happened to the ones who survived the winter in the barren land? These are the stories we want to tell, the tales of everyday people living extraordinary lives. We hope you'll join us as we explore Vinland, the land of plenty, and discover what really happened to the Norse who settled there. Over the next few weeks, we'll bring you stories from the best-selling book series by Canadian author Margaret Mahy, which tells the story of Leif Erikson's voyages to Vinland. The first book, The White Rocks, tells the story of the Norse settlement in Newfoundland and the clash between their culture and that of the native people. The second book, The Lost Ships, follows a young boy named Finn as he searches for the lost ships of Vinland with the help of an old woman who may hold the key to the mystery. We hope you'll join us on this epic journey as we uncover the secrets of Vinland and learn what really happened to the Norse who settled there. So sit back, grab a blanket, and prepare for an adventure that will take you to a land of mystery and intrigue. Who knows, you may just learn something new along the way. Chapter 2. Who were the Vikings? It's me, welcome to my channel. So at the end of Chapter 1, we started to answer the question, why did the Vikings explore and settle in Newfoundland? But to really get to that, I think we should probably start with an even more fundamental question. In the modern era, we generally think of the Vikings as rugged, fierce fighters who pillaged across Europe. That perception is partly because of Hollywood movies like How to Train Your Dragon and The Recent Northman, and partly because of the medieval chroniclers who took great pleasure in describing how the Vikings would attack churches and monasteries. But the reality was more complex than these stereotypes. We often think of the Vikings as warlike raiders, but they were also farmers and traders. In fact, most Vikings were farmers. They grew barley, oats, wheat, and vegetables like cabbage and onions. The fertile soil and mild climate of Scandinavia provided ample opportunity for farming. In addition, Scandinavian rivers were full of fish, so it was easy to supplement one's diet with fish. Most of the Vikings were not full-time farmers either. They had other occupations. Some men went fishing or herded reindeer. Others worked in crafts like woodworking or metalworking, and many men traded. The stereotypical Viking longship is usually depicted as being used only for warfare and raiding. But this was another misconception. Sure, the Vikings used their ships to go raiding, but they also used them for exploring and for trading. There's actually a saying from the age that goes, where the ship goes, there will the men go. This illustrates just how important the ships were to the Viking way of life. They depended on them to get around the rough coastline of Scandinavia, but they also depended on them to trade, to raid, and to explore. Before we move on, please take a second to subscribe if you haven't done so already. The term Viking comes from the Old Norse word Viking, which simply means pirate. When our Anglo-Saxon friends heard about these fierce fighters who lived far away in Scandinavia, they labeled them Vikings. The Vikings themselves didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Norsemen, or Norwegians, or Danes. Viking was an occupation, not an ethnicity. So when the people of Scandinavia went to sea, they were referred to as Vikings, whether they were raiders or explorers or traders. The Vikings sailed some very sophisticated ships. We usually call them longships, but that wasn't the name they gave them. They had names for each type of ship that they built, but we'll talk about that in a later chapter. The longships were fast and maneuverable, perfect for darting around the many islands and fjords of the North Sea and Baltic Sea. They were also sturdy enough to cross the choppy waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. In all, the Vikings built 3 types of ships. First, you have your typical longship, which was narrow and fast and sleek. These are the ships that the Vikings used for warfare and racing and exploring. Then you have what we call an air. It's a little bit different from the longship. It's wider and deeper and has a round bottom, so it's not as swift as the longship, but it can carry much more cargo. So if a Viking wanted to go into trade, he would use an air. Now, between the longship and the car are these big bulky things that the Vikings called snekia. They were huge vessels with flat bottoms so they could be beached. They were used mostly for transporting large amounts of people and goods, but they weren't really good on open seas. So these ships are rarely found outside of Scandinavian waters. The Vikings were expert navigators and shipbuilders. They developed curved-sided planks for their ships, which was new technology at the time. Curved planks meant that they didn't have to overlap the planks, which wasted wood and made the ship more vulnerable to leaks. To keep their ships afloat, the Vikings used oakum to seal the planks together. Oakum is made by taking a hempen rope and soaking it in water, and then twisting it up so tight that it becomes putty. They also used pitch, animal fat and moss to keep the ships waterproof. Moss, you ask? Yep, moss. Apparently, the Scandinavians used to gather a special kind of moss that grows over rocks, pick it, dry it out, and then beat it into a powder. And then they mixed that powder with melted animal fat and pitch, and used that mixture to coat the outer planks of their ships. But the thing that really enabled the Vikings to sail the open ocean was their mastery of the compass and the sail. The magnetic compass had been known in Scandinavia since at least the 8th century, and while it isn't certain that they were the first to use it, the Vikings were certainly among the first peoples to rely on it heavily. But they didn't call it a compass, they called it a finder stone. Here's how the finder stone worked. They had these lodestone rocks from Greenland. Lodestone is a natural magnetic rock. They take that lodestone rock and place it on a piece of driftwood, and then they defloat that piece of driftwood on top of a pan of water. The lodestone would always point south. So that SY we call the magnetic pole, that S near the North Pole, the south-seeking pole. So with this crude compass in hand, the Vikings could navigate the seas. And then there's the sail. The Vikings used square sails on their ships, which allowed them to sail directly into the wind. And this is what really set them apart from everyone else in Europe at the time. Square sails were nothing new. People had been using them for years, but most sailors were afraid to go sailing into the wind. They thought it was dangerous, but the Vikings embraced it. They used triangular lateen sails on their ships, which let them sail more efficiently and explore more areas. There are lots of misconceptions about Norse culture. For example, some people believe that the Vikings worshipped a big horned god named Thor. That's not true. Thor is a figure from the religious beliefs of the Germanic peoples further south. The religion of the Scandinavian Vikings was called Asatru, and it blended a number of different beliefs and practices. The word Asatru literally means God's path. In the Old Norse language, as means deity or god, and Troth means way or path. Now, in all likelihood, the term Asatru was used during the Viking Age to distinguish Norse beliefs from the emerging religion of Christianity. Now we don't know much about Norse beliefs today, because the surviving written sources were written by Christian monks who weren't particularly fond of the Norse religion. What we do know about Norse mythology comes primarily from 2 sources. The first is the Poetic Edda, also known as the Elder Edda. This was written down in Iceland in the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson, and while he wrote it down in the 13th century, it contained stories and poems that were passed down orally for hundreds of years before that. The second source is the Prose Edda, or Snorra Edda. Again, it was written by Snorri Sturluson, but it follows the same pattern as the Poetic Edda. The stories in it were told orally for generations before he wrote them down. As we mentioned in Chapter 1, Norse mythology is filled with tales of gods and monsters and heroes and adventures, but running through those stories are themes of family, survival, and hard work. Those aren't exactly things you'd read about in the newspaper every day. You can see these themes throughout Norse mythology. Take, for example, the story of Kvasir, who was killed by Loki. After his death, the gods make mead from his blood. Now this mead gives anyone who drinks it the gift of poetry. So you have this hero whose life is taken too soon. His life force is used to create something wonderful, something that brings joy to people. And then there's the theme of hard work. One of the most famous stories in Norse mythology is the story of the theft of Thor's hammer. If you're not familiar with it, here's a quick summary. Thor goes to Utgard, the land of the giants. He wants to marry the giant king's daughter, but in order to do so, he must first retrieve his hammer, which was stolen by the king. Along the way, he faces many challenges. He's tricked and humiliated, and made to look foolish. Finally, he reaches the king, who reveals that he's been drinking Thor's hammer mead. So the king gets drunk, falls asleep, and Thor regains his hammer. Now, obviously, the story has a happy ending, but it's not without its challenges. Thor has to overcome a lot. He has to learn how to fight different kinds of enemies. He has to survive all sorts of tests of strength and skill. And in the end, he doesn't win because he's a god. He wins because he works hard and perseveres. We've said it before, and we'll say it again. The Vikings didn't call themselves Vikings. They called themselves Norwegians or Danes, or they also called themselves men of the North or Northmen. And this is important because it shows us how they saw themselves. The Vikings were people who lived in a harsh environment. They lived in the north where the days were long and cold, in the winters, and the summers were short and sweet. The harsh conditions required hard work and perseverance. Everyone had to do their part to survive, and the men of the north did just that. They explored and traded and farmed and fished and built ships and survived. This brings us back to the question we posed at the beginning of this chapter. Why did the Vikings push westward? We'll answer that question next time. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a like and a comment below. Tell us what you think and tell us where you're watching from. I'm from Newfoundland, Canada. Until next time, thanks for watching. Erik the Red, infamous murderer, was exiled to Greenland. He established 2 settlements on the island. But how did life work there? What role did Greenland play in Viking expansion into North America? And what does archaeology tell us about the everyday lives of the people who lived here? This is chapter 3 of our series on the Vikings. After killing several men in a fit of rage, Erik the Red was exiled from Iceland for 3 years. Now, it's not exactly clear why he ended up in Greenland, but it might have something to do with the fact that his father, Thorvald, had previously been granted land there by King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. Erik set out to establish a farm there, but within a few years, he had founded 2 settlements. These became known as the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, and they existed for around 500 years between the 9th and 15th centuries. Greenland was an odd choice for settlement. It was almost completely devoid of trees and subject to extreme weather conditions. But Erik's pitched that this harsh environment was actually quite desirable. In a letter written by Erik's son, Leif, to the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, Greenland is described as the land of the completely black cliffs, where one could hang his clothes on a rope and dry them on hot stones. You know, like a washing line. Except instead of your average tumble dryer, they use lava rocks. Despite the dubious sales pitch though, Greenland's remoteness and rugged terrain made it very difficult to reach. There was no road system connecting the settlements with each other or with the rest of the world. This meant that for the people living there, ships were their only lifeline to the outside world. As a result, the Greenlanders were totally dependent on trade to bring in food, timber, and other necessities. As a consequence of this, they developed a culture that placed high importance on seafaring skills, exploration, and trade networks. They would have needed to travel to Iceland, Norway, and even back to Europe to get the goods that they wanted. The Greenlanders therefore became masters of ocean navigation and shipbuilding. Even today, Greenland has one of the largest coastlines in the world relative to its size, and traditional kayaks are still used for hunting, so there's a long tradition of working at sea there. The Greenlanders were also heavily reliant on the goodwill of neighboring kingdoms. The area of Greenland settled by the Norse was enormous. At its greatest extent, it stretched over half the island, which is larger than Sweden. The vast majority of the population, however, lived in a much smaller area in the southeast and southwest. The lack of arable land, extreme weather and limited access to natural resources forced the Greenlanders to hunt, fish, and herd sheep. Hunting seals and whales provided both meat and valuable materials for making clothing and housing. Sheep provided wool and meat, and they could also be bartered with or sold to other kingdoms. Sheep farming would have been similar to how it is done today in Iceland, where the animals are left to roam freely during the summer months, surviving mainly off the grasses and other vegetation available in the open tundra. Come winter, the sheep would seek shelter in specially constructed stone huts called a rhea, where they would stay until spring. The rhea were built with large flat stones to form a circle and then filled with earth and turf to make a dome shape. Some of these structures are still visible today, and you can even see the circular shape in aerial photographs. Life in Greenland was never easy, but it got really tough in the 13th century when the climate began to change. This caused temperatures to fall and disrupted established trading routes. The effects of this would have been felt most keenly in Greenland because of their heavy reliance on trade and their isolation. By the end of the 14th century, the Black Death had reached the island and devastated the population. Many people died, and there was a collapse in trade. These hardships may have contributed to the abandonment of the settlements. But before that, between the 10th and 12th centuries, the relative wealth and security of the period saw Greenland become a stepping stone for even more daring ventures across the Atlantic Ocean. After visiting Greenland, the famous Viking explorer Erik the Red led an expedition that discovered and settled the first part of North America at around the same time as the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus. Both accomplished feats of navigation and exploration, although history remembers the latter far more than the former. There were numerous voyages of discovery from Greenland, including those of Gorm the Old, who explored the southeast coast of Greenland and then traveled west and reached the island of Jan Mayen. Snormalized the Ganger, who sailed along the northeast coast of Greenland and also explored the coast of Labrador in Canada, and the above-mentioned Erik the Red's son Leif, who is credited with being the first European to set foot in North America. All of these explorers would have used a type of ship known as a nair, which was perfectly suited for the task ahead. These ships were larger than the typical Viking longship and were specifically designed for long-distance travel with their broad, deep hulls, which maximized cargo capacity. We know the story of Leif and his discovery of North America through the text known as the Saga of Erik the Red. According to this source, while sailing west from Greenland, Leif and his men became lost in a fog and eventually came upon an unknown land. They named this Vinland after the wild grapes that grew there. While some historians question the exact accuracy of the sagas, archaeological discoveries have corroborated many of the tales told within them. In addition to sagas, we also have runic inscriptions that shed light on the people's lives in Greenland. One such example is Thekli stone, which contains the longest runic inscription in Greenland, listing the names of the men who owned the ships involved in an expedition. Another inscription, the Roke runestone, records the journey of a man called Roke, who went to Greenland in the year 974. Runes were used for writing in the pre-Christian Norse language, and so these inscriptions are invaluable for learning more about the people who lived in Greenland. Most of what we know about the day-to-day lives of the Greenlanders comes from archaeology. Excavations have revealed details about their housing, diet, religion, and even daily objects. In summer 2013, an international team of archaeologists uncovered the remains of 16th century farms near the abandoned Norse settlement of Igalikku. Two main farmsteads were excavated, containing storage buildings, animal enclosures, and the remains of houses. Archaeologists found post holes that had once supported wooden buildings. The roof of one structure was covered in turf, similar to how modern Inuit houses are constructed. These farms were occupied for nearly 100 years. The team believes that they belonged to two families who were related, with each household consisting of around 10 people. Archaeologists also found storage facilities such as kilders, which were used for storing dried fish and other perishables. Animal bones from sheep, cattle, dogs, cats, chickens, pigs and horses showed that these settlers lived a mixed farming lifestyle. Their diet would have consisted mainly of fish and mutton, supplemented by dairy products. Another important building found on the site was a church, which helps us learn about the introduction of Christianity in Greenland. The church was built towards the end of the 15th century and was probably constructed by one of the two brothers who jointly owned the farms. The The church measured 25 meters by 8 meters and was built from stone. It had a pointed roof covered in turf and wooden benches. The presence of a church on the farmstead demonstrates how Christianity gradually replaced paganism among the Norse populations. However, it's also possible that the church was built as a symbol of power and wealth rather than a place of worship. In the 19th century, excavations in the town of Garchkot unearthed a runestone that recorded the death of a chief named Gunhild. She is believed to have converted the people of Garchkot to Christianity. If she had a church built in her honor, this may explain why the church on the farmstead was made of expensive imported stone rather than the cheaper local shale. Despite the small size of the church, it played a major role in the lives of the settlers. Archaeologists were able to determine its orientation by measuring the angles of the walls, which revealed that it faced roughly southwest, similar to the direction of the setting sun. The church was also aligned with the winter solstice, meaning that sunlight only reached the altar on December. This may indicate that religious practices in Greenland incorporated elements of the old pagan traditions, alongside Christian beliefs. By the time the farms were abandoned in the late Middle Ages, Greenland was home to around 5,000 people. With the end of the Viking Age and the onset of colder temperatures, life in Greenland became increasingly difficult. By the 15th century, there were fewer ships traveling to Greenland, and securing the raw materials necessary for building and maintaining a farm became harder. Perhaps some of the settlers simply decided to join their relatives in Iceland, while others moved to places like Newfoundland in search of better opportunities. Whatever the reason, the Norse settlements were ultimately abandoned, leaving behind two fascinating chapters in the Book of Greenland's history. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you want to be notified when we release our next video. So last time we left off with the end of chapter 3. We just got to Greenland, and we need to find out how the Greenlanders got there. Welcome back to Lost Origins. Like I said last time, I'm your host, and this is the series where we try to piece together the real history behind some of the most famous myths and legends from around the world. And we can start by talking about the sagas, because that's basically what this story is. You see, the sagas are stories which were first told orally by the Icelandic storytellers called the Skelds, and they were generally about legendary heroes and their deeds. These stories would have been originally performed in a poetic form while being accompanied by a harp or a fiddle, kind of like a musical storytelling. And after the tradition spread throughout Scandinavia during the Viking Age, they started writing them down sometime around the 13th century. They are actually one of the best sources for understanding the culture, values, and even geography of the Norse people. But we don't have a saga exclusively about Vinland. There are actually two sagas that we will have to read between the lines to understand how the Norse people reached the coast of North America. The first is the saga of the Greenlanders, which tells the story of how Erik the Red was banished from Iceland and then found a settlement in Greenland. And the second is the saga of Erik the Red, which goes over the life of his son Leif Erikson and the discovery of Vinland. So let's take a look at each of them individually. First, the saga of the Greenlanders. It starts out introducing Erik the Red, who was apparently known for doing bad things. He settled down a bit and had a son named Leif. When he decided to break one of the laws of the land by taking 2 slaves. For this crime, he was banished from Iceland and forced to go live in Greenland for 3 years. But Greenland wasn't exactly a day trip. So on the way over, Erik came across an island which he found to be very pleasant and decided to name it Landnestr, meaning Island of Evening, due to how quickly the sun set in the summer. And this is widely believed to be the island of Jan Mayen. Then he went over to Greenland and lived there for the 3 years. After that, he came back to Iceland, but not for long because he ended up killing a man in a fit of rage and had to flee again. This time he went back to Greenland, but he didn't just stay there. Instead, he continued on further west and made settlements along the coast. That's right. This is where we got the theory that the Norse established settlements in Newfoundland. But unfortunately, the saga of the Greenlanders doesn't really give us much more information than that. It only mentions that the people who lived there mostly herded sheep and hunted. And from the Icelandic sagas we know that there were 3 settlements along the west coast of Greenland. One at the southern tip of the large island called the Eastern Settlement, another in the middle called the Western Settlement, and a third one further north, which was abandoned after a couple of decades. But if we want to hear about how the Norse discovered this new land, we need to listen to the saga of Erik the Red. Now this saga is interesting because it actually has an author, an Icelandic scribe named Ari the Wise, who wrote it sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century. This saga was written after Snorri Sturluson published his book called the Edda, where he tried to collect all the old myths and legends into a single manuscript. But Snorri also tried to explain that these tales were nothing more than stories, and that there was no historical basis for them. Ari took a similar approach here and tried to give a fictional framework to these tales of exploration. And that makes sense because he lived in a time where Christianity was becoming more widespread, and he probably wanted to make sure that people understood these stories as fiction rather than fact, lest they think that fighting in a war with the Christian king was justified. Because God spoke to him through Odin. But despite that, the saga still gives us a lot of insight into the Norse exploration of North America. It opens with the story of a man named Bjarni who was traveling from Iceland to Greenland, when his ship was caught in a storm and blown off course to an unknown land. When he returned to Iceland, he told the tale of the new land and inspired a few brave adventurers to go check it out. The first was a guy named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who gathered a fleet of ships and set sail westward. The journey took them 3 weeks, and on the way they experienced heavy storms, foul winds and lots of fog, which led to infighting and a general sense of dread among the crew. One day they spotted land and went ashore to check it out, but they had brought no weapons with them and they were attacked by the natives, who were described as ugly, short and fierce. They retreated back to their ships and sailed away, but they didn't get too far before they had to turn around and go back. The natives had taken a liking to one of Thorfinn's men, a handsome guy named Hoskuld, and they kidnapped him. Thorfinn and his crew fought against the natives to rescue him, but they couldn't win, so they fled back home. A few years later, Thorfinn tried again, but the same thing happened. He was forced to flee after making it as far as a bay, which he named Marklands. After this, the saga shifts its focus to another member of Erik the Red's family, his nephew, Leif Erikson. He became a Christian after visiting England and France, but he was never able to escape his family's bloodlust. While sailing to Greenland, his crew mutinied against him because he wouldn't stop beating his slaves. So they dropped him off on an island and left him with a single farmhand. But Leif quickly found that the island was full of grapevines and wild wheat, and he even saw a building made out of timber. So he stayed there for 3 years until a ship came by and took him back to Greenland. When he told his father Erik about the abundance of resources on this new land, Erik organized an expedition to claim it for the Norse. But before they could leave, a storm destroyed most of the ships. And even though they tried again the next year, they were once again thwarted by the weather. But not to worry, because eventually Erik's daughter takes charge and convinces her brother to let her lead an expedition. She gathered a fleet of ships and set sail for Vinland. Along the way, she encountered a storm which killed many of her crew and damaged her ships. But that didn't stop her from continuing on to the coast of North America. Eventually, they landed in an area which looked just like what she had seen with her father on his previous voyage. She immediately claimed the land for the King of Norway and began to explore. They traveled inland where they found vast fields of wheat, grapes, fresh fish, hunting grounds and no enemies. So Freydis and her small group of survivors stayed there for the winter and built up a settlement. However, she soon grew paranoid that the men wanted to kill her and steal the land for themselves. So she set them all against each other and started cutting off people's hands and feet, which led to her eventually killing everyone except for one of her brothers and a handful of others. And they were only able to get back to Greenland by hitching a ride on the ship of a Christian monk. But that doesn't mean that the Norse gave up on Vinland, because after that story is over, we're introduced to another one of Erik the Red's sons, named Thorvald, who decides that he wants to explore the area for himself. On the way there, his sister shows up again, looking for some forgiveness and warning him about how dangerous the natives are. Well, Thorvald didn't listen and instead headed straight for the coast of Vinland, where he and his crew landed and started exploring. Unfortunately, when they visited one of the villages, some of the men got drunk and started attacking the locals. So Thorvald had to defend them and chase the attackers away. As punishment, the locals threw a spear at him which hit him in the knee, causing him to bleed to death. Before that though, he did manage to take a small amount of timber back to his ship, which he used to build a cross and dedicate the land to King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway. After burying him there, they sailed away and returned to Greenland. I know that was a lot of names and places and events, but hopefully it helps to give you a rough idea of the sequence of events that these sagas present to us. But now the question becomes, how much of this is true? Obviously, we know that Eric the Red explored and settled in Greenland, and it's likely that Norse explorers reached the shores of North America. In fact, we have archaeological evidence in Newfoundland which proves that the Norse had settlements there around the year 1000, but that's the thing. All we have is evidence. We don't have any surviving manuscripts from the Norse people that tell the story of the settlements, which means that all the details in these sagas about Vinland are open to interpretation. We don't know how much of this is based on actual events, how much is pure mythology, or how much was written by Ari to make the Norse explorations seem more heroic. And honestly, we may never know. But the archaeological evidence confirms that at least the Norse people did reach North America. So maybe the sagas are just giving us the mythical roadmap of how they got there. If you enjoyed this episode, then be sure to follow Lost Origins for more. Today we are going to read Chapter 5 of the Saga of the Greenlanders, or Erik the Red's saga, which is about Leif Erikson and his voyage to the land that would become known as Vinland. This saga is one of the best sources for the history of the Vikings. There are two main sagas about Erik the Red, this one, which covers his life and his sons, and the other, which covers his daughter. Both were written around 1300 AD. As with the previous episodes, I am reading the entire saga in chapters and sharing my thoughts. If you would like to follow along, the text can be found in the description. I will put a link there to a translation by Peter Sawyer. And now, let us set sail to Vinland. Okay, so right off the bat, I want to point out that Chapter 5 begins with some weird storytelling mode stuff. It says here, in bygone days when our forefathers were still discovering the land beyond the sunset, there came into being a wonderful tale which people used to tell of a great lord whose name was Leif. His father was Erik the Red, the son of Thorvald, and he went on voyages into the distant North Atlantic and discovered new lands. So basically the author is telling us that what follows is a story that has been told for generations before it was finally written down. He also tells us who Leif's father is, but I think we knew that already from the title of the book, which translates to the Saga of Erik the Red. And then he finishes by saying that Leif went on voyages to new lands. So just wanted to point that out, because sometimes when reading Old Norse texts, it helps to know how they are constructed. Like, for example, in medieval poems, if the first line tells us something, then the next line will often summarize or qualify what was said in the first line. Anyway, back to the story. Let's get started. Okay, so this chapter is all about how Leif Erikson discovered Vinland, but it doesn't start with him setting sail. Instead, it starts with another guy named Bjorn, who had gotten lost at sea a few years earlier. Bjorn was on his way to Greenland when a storm knocked him off course, and he ended up floating around in the sea for weeks until eventually land appeared on the horizon. He had stumbled upon the shores of Newfoundland, which at the time was an unknown land to Europeans. But rather than going ashore, he sailed back the way he came, turned around and headed back home to Iceland. But while he was sailing, the wind shifted and blew him off course again, and he once again found himself blown back to the same coast. Again, he saw land but did not go ashore. Instead, he turned around again and headed back to Iceland. So there he is, sitting in Iceland after these two voyages thinking, I have seen land twice. I know there is land there, but I don't know where exactly it is. So he goes to his friend Herleif and says, listen, I need your help. We should get together a crew, go out looking for that land and find it. Then we can divide it between ourselves, rule over it jointly. But Herleif thought, no, thanks. No way, man. I'm not doing this. I don't want any part of this. So then Bjorn went to another friend of his named Thorgils and asked him, and he said yes. So the two of them got together, a crew, set sail and went out looking for the land that Bjorn had seen earlier. But once again, they too were blown off course and ended up in the same place where Bjorn had landed. This time, however, they did go ashore and started exploring the coast. They found forests filled with tall trees, grapes on the bushes, wild wheat in the fields, and birds nesting in large numbers on the cliffs. Basically everything that you would expect to find in the forest, on the cliffs and in the fields of Newfoundland. It was a bountiful land, ripe for the taking. So they marked their territory, made a cairn and called it the Cape of Winds. Then they continued traveling south along the coast until they came across a river. They followed the river upstream until they reached a lake. Then they left the lake and traveled inland, where they stayed the night. The following morning they got up early, prepped their gear, and set off into the forest to look for building materials so they could construct a boat. After walking a while, they heard the sound of an axe being used, looked around and couldn't see anyone. Then they heard a man's voice shouting, "Who's there? Who's in the wood?" Then, suddenly, out of the corner of their eye, they saw a man run by. He looked hairy and huge. Then he ran off again into the forest. When Thorgilla saw this, he grabbed his spear and charged after the man, but he ran away. So then Thorgilla ran after him, and Bjarni stopped him and said, "No, wait, don't chase him anymore. He probably doesn't mean us any harm. Let's just go back to the ship and get out of here." So they did, and when they arrived back at the ship, they were surprised to find a small boat waiting for them. So they left the big boat where it was and got into the small boat. Then they set sail and began working their way home, and that is where we will pick up in the next episode. If you would like to watch that episode when it comes out, please subscribe. Also, if you would like to support the channel, please consider supporting through various platforms. I have put links to those platforms in the description below. Thank you. Okay. Now it is time for me to share my thoughts on this passage. Now, before we begin, I want to point out something that I didn't mention in the summary. In the original Old Norse, this whole chapter is written in the past tense. However, in the past 2 episodes, I read them in the present tense, because they were describing things as if they were happening at the time that they were being told. That's kind of the literary style that is being used. But this chapter is very different. This chapter is very clearly written in the past tense. There is no attempt to make it seem like it is happening in the moment, so I'm going to read it in the past tense as well. Okay, now let's talk about why this chapter is different from the last 2. Chapters 2 and 3 were both stories about Erik the Red. They told of how he was born and how he committed manslaughter and had to leave Greenland and settle in Iceland. Those are his stories. But this chapter is not about Leif, it is about Bjarni. And we are only given this information about Leif in the opening lines. So why the switch? Well, I believe it is because this saga is about Erik the Red, not Leif Erikson. So the stories included in this saga are only there as much as they pertain to Erik. For example, chapter 3 told the story of how Erik's grandfather, Torvald the Good, established Greenland as a settlement. That is relevant to Erik because he was Torvald's grandson. But Bjarni's discovery of Vinland is only tangentially related to Leif and therefore to Erik. So I believe that is why this chapter was written separately. And in fact, this might even be the only chapter in this saga that does not directly relate to Erik. Now, to be clear, this saga is absolutely about Leif. It is one of the main sources for Leif's story. But this saga is about Erik the Red. So in order to maintain focus on Erik, all of the other characters and events that appear in this saga are filtered through his bloodline. So as we continue to read this saga, anytime we encounter a new character or event, we have to ask ourselves, how is this related to Erik? And that will help us to understand the purpose of including this story. One of the reasons that this story is included is because it motivated Leif to go on a voyage. Now, keep in mind, this is a saga, not a news article. Sagas were meant to entertain. So obviously there is a lot of storytelling license taken here. Anyway, it motivated Leif to go on a voyage to find the land that his father had found. And the story itself is pretty interesting. It is a fun adventure story. But there is also a reason that this is included that we will talk about more later. Leif discovered a new land for the Greenlanders, a land full of all sorts of resources. But if you compare it to the land that Erik discovered, it was a much smaller thing. Erik discovered an island with huge open spaces where they could raise livestock, farm crops, and build houses. It was a perfect place to establish a settlement. Okay, now, like I said, Leif did not spend any time in this new land, but it is important to remember that when he returned to Greenland and told people about the land that he had seen, he did not say that it was like Greenland. He did not say, "Hey guys, check it out. There is an island over there just like Greenland where you can build a house and live." And no, he described a land covered in forests, a land unlike anything they knew. To them, it must have sounded like a magical place, and I believe that is why Leif decided to spend the winter in Greenland before returning to Vinland the following year. He wanted to drum up interest in the land. He needed people to be excited about going there, to be interested in the possibilities. Had he gone back the next spring and tried to get people to go to a place that was just like Greenland, nobody would have been interested. But when you describe a land with tall trees, grapes and wheat, all of a sudden everyone wants to go. You can imagine the crowds of people showing up to the harbor, all eager to be the first to claim some land for themselves, eager to strike it rich. So much so that according to chapter 6, there wasn't enough land for everyone who showed up. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening to chapter 5 of the Saga of the Greenlanders as much as I enjoyed reading it. Please leave any thoughts or comments that you have in the comments section below. I love reading your comments and responding to them. So if you have anything that you would like to add to what I have said here, please feel free to do so. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one. Chapter 6. Life in Vinland. Attempted settlements. When we left off last time, Thorfinn Karlsefni had just completed his first voyage to Vinland and was preparing for his second. The saga tells us that he gathered a large fleet, 35 ships in all, with over 160 settlers to found a permanent settlement in Vinland. So now we get to explore what life was like at this settlement in today's episode. The main saga source for this episode is the Vinland Saga, Chapter 6. I'll provide more details on these sagas in a later episode, but suffice it to say there are two versions of each. This one comes from the manuscript known as FT, which has chapters 5 and 6 of the Vinland Sagas. It also contains the last 3 chapters of the Erik the Red Saga and the entire Gunbjorn the Wise Saga. In this episode, we're going to focus primarily on chapter 6, but keep an eye out for some interesting bits from chapter 5, as well as the other sagas in this manuscript. So let's jump into the saga. We find Thorfinn settling his people in a place called Brattahala, or the Broad River Valley. This place likely corresponds to modern Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and here we get our first taste of daily life in Vinland. People are busy planting crops, building shelters and exploring the river, but there's no shortage of work. The river was wide and deep and went far inland. Many went up it to hunt for game. There were great numbers of moose there, so large that they had to be shot with 2 arrows, one in the heart and one in the neck, and even then they would sometimes escape. Some went down to the sea to fish. Others chopped wood and made themselves wattle and daub houses. These early houses were small, only about half a bay wide, and lacked gables, as if they were not intended to be permanent. As summer waned, the settlers prepared for winter. Now that their houses were finished, they set to catching fish and hunting animals to preserve for eating in the winter. They needed to hurry, though, because the winter was mild and did not freeze the land. If the ice came too late, the preserves might spoil. Luckily, the winter turned out harshly and froze everything solid. This meant the settlers could travel across the ice-gemmed rivers to new areas. The ice also kept wild animals away from the settlement and closer together, so the hunters had better luck. When spring came, the settlers traveled around to see what was left of their crops. To their delight, they found that the wheat had sprouted and the barley was almost ready to harvest. That was a great omen, but it meant that the threat of wild men coming to steal their crops was now very real. We know from the last episode that the Norse encountered a group of indigenous people in this area who the Norse called Skrælings, a word that literally means slashers, and referred to them as such because they practiced a type of slash and burn agriculture. Skrælings was a blanket term used by the Norse to refer to any indigenous people they encountered in North America, and they appear to have been familiar to the Norse in southern Greenland before the Vinland Voyages. In fact, we can probably assume that Thorfinn knew exactly what he was getting into when he sailed to Vinland, even if there were no Skræling villages in the immediate vicinity of the Norse settlement. This does not mean that the Norse were completely alone in Vinland, as shown by the discovery of a Norse camp near Lonso Meadows, Newfoundland. The site of Lonso Meadows shows that the Norse definitely ventured further west than the general area of Cape Cod. But when we hear about them interacting with the Skrælings in the sagas, we can safely assume that they're talking about a different area farther south, perhaps like modern-day New England. Thorfinn's people spent the rest of the summer harvesting their crops and preparing for the arrival of more settlers. When fall came, a second fleet arrived with more people, supplies and livestock. These included Thorfinn's brother Thorvaldur, who would help him lead the settlement. With so many new people, the settlers built a wall around the town to protect themselves from the Skrælings, who had begun to harass them. The Norse were already having problems with a neighboring tribe of Skrælings, who wanted the Norse to leave. I don't think it's too much to say that Thorfinn's settlement was controversial. I mean, he and his people just showed up on the coast of North America and started building a settlement. I imagine the local population wouldn't be too thrilled about that. Anyway, these Skrallings were fierce fighters, and one stole Thorgil's sword when he fought against him and nearly killed him. Thorgil slew the Skralling, but from then on, he was afraid to go outside the settlement without armor. Eventually, Thorfinn and his brother decided to broker peace with the Skrallings. They summoned the nearby chiefs and offered to trade with them. The chiefs agreed, but when they met again, the Norse brought only insults and mockery. They mocked the Skrallings for being short of stature and uncouth. They said they looked like hairy women and seemed surprised that they didn't all wear pants. Maybe they expected loincloths. The Norse also thought the Skrallings were dumb and tried to trick them with poor translations, saying things like, "We want your women," when really they were offering to trade cloth. Not surprisingly, the Skrallings' response to this was not positive, and a fight broke out. The Skralling grabbed a Norse shield and hit one of the Norsemen in the knee with it, breaking his leg. The Norsemen were able to fend off the attack, but it was clear that the Skralling were too numerous and aggressive to fight. So Thorfinn decided to try diplomacy. He told the Skrallings that they would give back the shield and whatever else they took if the Skrallings would agree to stay away from the settlement. The Skrallings accepted, and after burying a blood-feud hatchet, the two groups traded for a while. The Norse got deerskins, and the Skrallings got cloth and ironware. Then the Skrallings departed. When the Norse regrouped, they noticed that the Skrallings had taken some of their fence palings and piled them up in front of their village. The next time the Skrallings visited, Thorfinn asked them about it, and they said they were making a fort. Thorfinn replied that they should do that, since they were such fierce fighters. He also said that the Norse would build a church in Vinland, and that they should come to see it when it was done. The Skrallings laughed at that, and said that the Norse were always talking about building a church but never did. Thorfinn asked them what they would have to do to believe that the Norse were going to build a church. The Skrallings challenged them to make the church out of solid stone. Thorfinn agreed, and the Skrallings departed. Then Thorfinn realized that he had gotten himself into a bit of a pickle. To be fair, I think that's an understatement. The Norse were supposed to be staying for 5 years, and now they VA'd pissed off the locals so much that they VA'd challenged the Norse to build a church entirely out of stone, or else. I don't know what else the Norse were planning on building it out of, but I suppose that's the least of their worries right now. They had been in Vinland for several years at this point, and were growing tired of living in wattle and daub huts. They decided it was finally time to build proper stone houses. They also cut down a lot of trees to use as firewood because they had been using driftwood until now. Sadly, this proved to be the undoing of the settlement. While everyone was busy cutting down trees, the fields were abandoned and the Skrallings reclaimed them. Then the promised ships never came, and the settlers became desperate. Finally, Thorfinn and his brother decided to summon the Skrallings to declare war. The settlers locked themselves in their houses and waited. When the Skrallings arrived, they set fire to the abandoned farmlands. Thorfinn and his brother rushed out of the house to stop them, but the battle did not go well. The settlers lost several men, and the rest retreated back to their houses, scared for their lives. No one dared leave the settlement again. Finally, Thorfinn's ships arrived and rescued the remaining settlers. Thorfinn and his brother stayed behind to settle accounts with the Skrallings, but we don't know what happened because the manuscript ends right here. So why did the settlement fail? I'd say there were several contributing factors. The Norse were not native to Vinland and had no experience living in such a harsh climate. They didn't know how to properly grow crops, prepare for the winters, hunt animals, or build shelters. All of these things took time to learn, and in the meantime, they were dependent on supplies from Europe. Once those supplies ran out, they were on their own, and it wasn't sustainable. Thanks for watching. Next time, we'll cover the Norse exploration of the interior of North America and the fascinating theories about where exactly they went. Until then, take care. Okay, so we're now done with all the major land masses in North America, at least for this series. We have covered the very northernmost tip of the continent, Greenland, and the southernmost tip, Tierra del Fuego. We've done Florida, the heartland of the Mayan lands, the Mississippi Valley, and the Pacific Northwest coast. And what I wanted to do for this chapter was something a little different, and that is talk about the indigenous peoples who lived on the land when Europeans arrived. And since it's been such a source of contention throughout history, I figured, why not get ahead of the problem by talking about it now? So let's do it. Now, obviously, there are hundreds of different cultures and nations that would fall under the term Indigenous Peoples of North America. But since I only have time for one episode, I did not want to go down that road, because I feel like that could turn into a mini-series unto itself. And besides, today we're going to be talking about the people the Vikings likely met when they showed up in North America around 500 years before Christopher Columbus. So let's start off by answering the question, who were the Vikings meeting in North America? Well, that's actually a bit trickier than you might think because we don't know for sure. It's almost certain that when the Vikings arrived in Newfoundland, they did meet people. But who exactly those people were is still an open question among historians. There are a few different theories, but the top two contenders are either the Beothuk of Newfoundland or the Micmac. The reason the Beothuk are considered the most likely candidate is that they are the only known group from this region that had large-scale contact with Europeans. Prior to the Vikings, they first encountered Portuguese fishermen in the early 1500s, and then later they would become the only Native American group to ever be completely wiped out by European diseases. So it does fit the timeline. Plus, records from Basque whalers tell of conflicts with a local tribe that sounds pretty similar to the Beothuk. The Micmac, on the other hand, are a lot more difficult to pin down. That's because they are part of the larger group known as the Micmac peoples, which also includes the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Abenaki, and these groups lived farther inland along the Atlantic coast, starting from Nova Scotia down to present-day Maine. But they all share a common language group and cultural similarities. If we are to believe the oral histories of the Micmac people, their ancestors had migrated over to North America from a place called Micmachi, which they described as a distant land filled with ice. This would seem to imply that they came from the north, perhaps even Greenland. And if that's true, then it's quite possible that they did interact with the Vikings. But the question there is, how long ago did this happen? If we take the Micmac creation stories literally, then it would put their arrival in North America at the same time as the Vikings, around the year 1000. But scholars have pointed out some problems with that theory, namely that the creation stories have clear Christian influences in them, such as the story of the Great Flood, which is a little weird if we read trying to use them to argue that the Micmac were there at the same time as the Vikings. So maybe the Micmachi they were talking about wasn't exactly Greenland. Perhaps it was somewhere else. Or maybe they just took the creation stories literally. I don't know. I'm not a historian. Either way though, we can be fairly confident that the Vikings were interacting with a group that spoke an Algonquin language, because when French colonists came to the area in the early 1600s, they reported that the natives they met there spoke an Eastern dialect of Algonquin. And that is very interesting because the Eastern dialect was virtually identical to the one spoken by the Micmac. So if the Micmac were there before the Vikings, then it makes sense that their language evolved into the Eastern dialect we see later on. That said, just because the Vikings likely interacted with an Algonquin-speaking people doesn't necessarily mean they were the Beothuk or the Micmac. They may have been a completely different group who spoke a very similar language. Unfortunately, since these people didn't leave behind any written records, it's really hard to say for sure. All we have to go off of are either biased accounts from Europeans or the oral histories of the surviving tribes. But regardless of who exactly they were, the Vikings were likely meeting a group of people whose way of life was vastly different than their own. When the Vikings showed up in North America, the predominant mode of transportation was still the canoe. In fact, in order to travel between the various tribes, that was often the only way to do it. Boats were either made from birch bark or from the skins of animals like moose, and they were used not only for transportation, but also for hunting and fishing, which were the primary means of getting food. Since there were no domesticated animals in North America at this time, aside from dogs, the only meat the locals would have had access to was what they could hunt. Now, if you're familiar with the geography of Newfoundland, you'll probably notice that this doesn't sound very sustainable. As we saw in Chapter 3, Newfoundland is pretty much just barren rock. There isn't a whole lot to hunt there. But that wasn't the case back then, because the forests were a lot thicker and the animal population was bigger than it is now. Another thing that the Vikings would have noticed is the abundance of wild rice in the region. Wild rice grows naturally in marshes and lakes, and it was an extremely valuable food source. In fact, many historians believe that the abundance of wild rice was a major factor in the success of the mound builders. So needless to say, a Viking wouldn't have had too much trouble finding something to eat in North America. Still though, it was nothing compared to what they were used to back home. The amount of natural resources available in North America was staggering. There were vast fields of wild rice, dense forests full of animals, and bountiful fisheries. The Vikings could have easily lived off the land if they chose to, and for all we know, they probably did. After all, when the Norse explorer Eric the Red was banished to Iceland, he lived in Newfoundland for a while and supposedly survived off the fish and berries. But although the natural resources were abundant, the locals were still living in small villages and didn't have any permanent settlements or large cities. In fact, in all of North America, the only city that would even come close to being called a city was probably Cahokia. But it wasn't until after the year 1000 that it started to grow. And besides, Cahokia was located in what is today the Midwestern United States, thousands of kilometers away from where the Vikings settled. To make matters worse for the poor Vikings, the climate of Newfoundland is not exactly warm and inviting. If you've ever been there, you know that it gets pretty cold. And if you've never been there, just imagine the stereotypical weather of New England and then make it slightly worse. That's basically what the climate of Newfoundland is like. So even though the natural resources were plentiful, the weather would have made it impossible for the Vikings to build anything permanent there. And that was probably one of the reasons they eventually left. Another reason could have been disease, because unlike Europe, there were very few Old World diseases in the Americas. However, just like the Native Americans would devastate Europe in the 1600s, the Vikings could have brought diseases that devastated the native populations. Unfortunately, we don't have any evidence of that, but it's certainly possible. In the end, though, the Vikings would only stay in North America for a few short decades, and then their settlements would be abandoned and the Norse presence in the region would fade into myth. The only reason we know about it at all is because of the archaeological evidence uncovered at Meadows. It wasn't until centuries later that the Norse would return to North America, and that won't happen for another 500 years. Join me next time for Chapter 8, as we explore the age of exploration and find out what happens when the Old World and the New World collide. In 1960, amateur archaeologists Helge and Anstein Ingstad discovered an archaeological site that forever changed our understanding of Viking exploration. What they found was evidence that Vikings had established a settlement in Newfoundland, Canada, centuries before Christopher Columbus ever set foot in the New World, and it's all preserved in an incredible state due to the acidic soils of the region. Let's find out more about the archaeology of Vinland in this episode of Secrets of the Past. The story of the discovery of the Norse settlement at Meadows begins with the amateur archaeologists themselves. Helge and Anstein Ingstad were a Norwegian married couple who shared a fascination for history and archaeology. They began their work together excavating sites in Norway, but soon turned their attention to the possibility of Norse exploration of North America. This is because in the 19th century, an Icelandic sagas or storyteller named Ari Thorgilsson compiled a collection of Old Norse literature known as the Orkneyinga saga, which contained references to voyages of discovery made by Icelander Baili the Lucky and his brother Thorvald. The saga tells how Thorvald led a group of explorers across the ocean to a land filled with wild grapes, which the Vikings called Vinland. Modern scholars generally believe that Vinland was located somewhere along the northeast coast of North America, but where exactly? The Ingstads believed that the best place to look was in Newfoundland, Canada, specifically at a place called Meadows. There were two reasons for this. Firstly, soil acidity in this area of Newfoundland would have made the location unsuitable for human habitation in later centuries. But the acidic conditions also meant that organic materials such as wood, leather and textiles would be incredibly well preserved. Secondly, according to the Orkneyinga saga, one of the places visited by Baili and Thorvald was an island with a large fjord, or inlet, much like the one found at Meadows. Intrigued, the Ingstads decided to investigate, but before they could get down to any serious digging, they needed to gain permission from the provincial government. Thankfully, they had an unexpected ally in Premier Joseph Smallwood, who had previously promoted the province as the potential site of the mythical city of Vinland. Once the archaeologists received permission, they began excavating a series of trial holes across the site in the summer of 1960, and to their excitement, they uncovered fragments of a stone wall foundation, several iron objects, and the edge of a metal cauldron. Their initial findings convinced them that the site was undoubtedly Norse in origin. Over the next few years, the Ingstads returned to Meadows every summer with a growing team of researchers. In total, the excavations lasted for 8 field seasons. between 1960 and 1966, and what they found during those 8 seasons of work was truly remarkable. Perhaps most exciting was the discovery of numerous pieces of iron, including nails, a horseshoe, a knife, a cauldron, and parts of a musket. This was especially significant because the style of these objects could be dated to the 10th and 11th century, precisely the time period when the Vikings are thought to have explored and settled in Greenland and Vinland. Another fascinating find was the turf houses, which were typical of Norse architecture. The turf houses were constructed from stone foundations, topped with layers of sod or turf, which was then painstakingly cut so that the surfaces were flat. These buildings were then covered with thick layers of sod to form steeply pitched roofs. The walls and roofs were further strengthened with wooden stakes. In all, the archaeologists uncovered the remains of 8 turf houses at Meadows, suggesting that this was a fairly large settlement. Additionally, other domestic structures included workshops, storage areas, and animal pens. One of the workshops contained the remains of a loom and spindle whorls, indicating that the people living here were not only hunters and fishermen, but also produced textiles. And a wide range of artifacts recovered from the site, including combs, needles, and bone buttons, suggested that the residents of Meadows had skills in woodworking and metalworking. Also, the variety of goods implied that the settlement was a permanent home rather than a temporary camp. The final pieces of the puzzle came with the discovery of 3 skeletons in 1961. Unfortunately, due to the acidic soil conditions, the bones were too fragile to be removed from the site and were later lost to natural erosion. But analysis of the bones while they were still in the ground revealed that 2 of the individuals were male and 1 was female, based on the shape of their pelvic bones. Furthermore, scientists determined that the male skeletons were around 35 and 45 years old at the time of death, while the female was likely in her early 20s, although their identities remain unknown. These individuals were given the names Rowan and Vebjorg by the Inks. Taken together, all of the evidence clearly indicated that the site of Meadows was indeed a Norse settlement. The artifacts, the turf houses, and even the skeletons all pointed to the fact that a community of Vikings had lived there several centuries before Columbus arrived in the Americas. In fact, the Orkney saga tells us that Thorvald established a settlement at Vinland and appointed one of his men named Turka to govern the colony in his absence. Turka would go on to rule over the settlement for 3 years before he and his men sailed back to Scandinavia. Could Turka be one of the skeletons discovered at Meadows? Maybe, but without knowing their identities for sure, we can only speculate. Today, the site of Meadows is protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is also open to the public as a museum where visitors can learn about the discovery and excavation of the site, as well as the fascinating history of Viking exploration. A recent research project, undertaken in 2021, has helped fill in some of the gaps in our knowledge of the settlement. Using non-invasive technology such as ground-penetrating radar and magnetometers, archaeologists were able to identify several new structures at the site, including 2 large longhouses, more storage buildings, as well as a possible sauna. They also discovered the remains of a 3rd individual, whose skeleton was too badly eroded to be examined. Interestingly, the researchers believe that the new structures may represent a second phase of occupation at the site, although it's unclear why the settlement was abandoned and when exactly this occurred. In addition to shedding light on the daily lives of the Norse settlers at Meadows, the 2021 study also addressed the question of how the Vikings managed to survive in such an inhospitable environment. According to archaeologist Sarah Parcock, the researchers discovered evidence that the Vikings at Meadows primarily subsisted on marine resources such as fish and shellfish. This conclusion was based on the discovery of butchered animal bones, including the bones of seals, which are a particular favorite of the Vikings. The archaeologists also noted the presence of microbands, which are thin layers of sediment deposited in bogs and often contain pollen and plant remains. Analysis of the microbands from Meadows revealed a surprising amount of cultivated plants, including barley, oats, wheat, and peas. This evidence suggests that the Vikings grew their own crops in the fertile floodplain near the settlement, which may have been used to feed livestock such as sheep and cattle. Therefore, it seems that the Vikings were able to adapt to the challenging environment of Newfoundland by relying primarily on marine resources while supplementing their diet with locally grown crops. As research at the site continues, we can be sure that even more secrets of the past will be uncovered. In the meantime, however, we can be grateful for the incredible preservation at Meadows and the opportunity it has given us to learn about this important chapter in history. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and join me next time for more secrets of the past. Until then, remember to stay curious. Chapter 9. The Mystery of Where is Vinland? Where exactly was Vinland? This is something that has been hotly debated for centuries among historians, archaeologists, and just people with an interest in the history of exploration. There are some who believe it was located in Newfoundland at a place called Meadows. However, there are many who believe this is wrong and that the real Vinland was somewhere much further south. But where exactly? Some say New Brunswick, others say Nova Scotia, and others even say as far south as New England. And then we have the name itself, Vinland. What does it mean? Well, that is also up for debate. Some scholars say it means wineland, while others say it actually means pastureland. So what does the name Vinland really mean, and where was it located? Let's find out. In this series, we look at some of the most important moments in history and try to answer questions that may have never had a definitive answer. Like, why did Ivan the Terrible eat his son? You can learn more through additional resources. Vinland. The mystery surrounding Vinland starts with the sagas themselves. These stories were written down around the 13th century, but they recount stories that took place around 800 years earlier. The sagas were passed down orally for generations before being written down, which means there could have been changes made to them over time. Maybe something was added, maybe something was taken away. We simply don't know. The story goes that a man by the name of Leif traveled to Vinland around the year 999 AD. He would sail back to Greenland to tell the tale of his adventures, but he would soon return to Vinland with a group of settlers looking for land to farm and build a settlement. There is a chance that the Vinland mentioned in the sagas is not one single place, but several places. As Leif explored the coastline, he may have seen different locations and called them all Vinland. Perhaps when he returned with settlers, they landed somewhere else and so thought they were going back to Vinland, when in fact they had found somewhere new. This may explain why the sagas are sometimes contradicting when describing the geography of Vinland. So what do we actually know about Vinland based on the sagas? Well, for starters, it was clearly an island because that is how the Norsemen would get there. They sailed across the ocean. It was also said to be an island full of wood, wild animals, and fresh water. Most importantly though, it was said to be full of grass and suitable for farming. In fact, it was described as being a lush, green land with deep, wide rivers. It was said to be the best land the Norsemen had ever seen, filled with large forests of oak trees, many animals, and no bears. Based on this description, we can probably discount some parts of North America right off the bat. If it was full of oak trees, then it couldn't have been anywhere north of the southern United States. It also couldn't have been too far south, because if it was, the Norsemen would have encountered the rest of the natives and other explorers from Europe. There was also no mention of any settlements when Leif first visited Vinland. However, he did say that there was evidence that someone had been there before him. He described seeing the skeleton of a man, half buried in the sand with an arrow through his neck. When the Norsemen returned to set up a settlement in Vinland, they cut down the local trees to make houses and furniture. But when they tried to burn the wood in their fireplaces, the smoke was so thick that they could barely breathe. The wood must have been resinous, perhaps pine or spruce. The Norsemen stayed there for 3 years, farming, hunting, and exploring. During their stay, they visited a native settlement, where they traded with the locals and learned about the land. The Norsemen called the natives Skrellings, and although they seemed friendly at first, later turned out to be liars and traitors. What happened to the Norsemen? Well, according to the sagas, the Skrellings attacked the Norsemen in the middle of the night and killed all but 14 of them. The remaining survivors escaped in their boats and headed back to Greenland. And that was the end of the Norsemen in Vinland. Okay, so based on the description of the land, the climate, and the lack of other European explorers, the most likely place for Vinland is somewhere on the northeastern coast of North America. There are a few places that fit this description, but none of them are exactly what the Norsemen described. First, we have Newfoundland. Specifically, we are talking about the tip of the island, Meadows. Between 1960 and 1964, archaeologist Kathleen Fiorello and a team of Canadian and American researchers excavated a site in Meadows. Here they discovered the remains of 8 buildings, a boatyard, storage pits, and a variety of other artifacts. They believed this was the site of the Norse settlement from the sagas. Further excavations have revealed that the settlement was only occupied for a very short time, maybe less than a year, and that it was destroyed in a massive storm, maybe a hurricane. While it's certainly possible that this was the location of the Norse settlement described in the sagas, there are some problems. First, the sagas say the Norsemen stayed in Vinland for 3 years, but the archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement was only occupied for a matter of months. Second, the sagas describe Vinland as having large forests of oak trees, but there are no oak trees in Newfoundland. Finally, the sagas say that the land was like nothing the Norsemen had ever seen. Yet Newfoundland looks pretty much like any other barren, rocky part of the Canadian Arctic. There are no palm trees, no strange animals, no lush vegetation. It just doesn't match up. This leads us to the next location, New Brunswick, and even further south, Nova Scotia. Both places have oak trees and a milder climate than Newfoundland, but neither place matches the description given in the sagas. It is possible that the sagas are wrong about the oak trees, or that the Norsemen could have landed in a few different places and called them all Vinland. After all, the word Vinland could simply mean land of the wine or vine, not necessarily a place full of oak trees. Perhaps we should also consider the name Vinland. Was it really Vinland or was it something else? Could the name have been corrupted over time? Could it have been pronounced differently when it was spoken in Old Norse? According to Dr. Neil Price of the University of Valdo, there is little physical evidence left of the Norse settlement. There is one clue that remains, and that is the name Vinland. The name Vinland, according to some scholars, could mean wineland or pastureland. Professor Henrik Williams of the University of Manitoba believes that the name Vinland was a mistranslation by the English chronicler John of Worcester. When he wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he believed that the Norse name for the land was actually Markland, meaning pastureland. But what is interesting is that in the 13th century, when the sagas were written, the term Vinland was used to refer to the entire North Atlantic region, including Greenland and Iceland. So the term Vinland in the sagas could refer to the same thing that John of Worcester called Muck, or perhaps it could have referred to another place entirely. The professor goes on to say that if we take the saga descriptions of Vinland at face value, then it fits better geographically with Cape Cod or even Long Island. However, the majority of scholars believe that the Norsemen did not explore this far south. Due to the harsh climate and dangerous waters, the Gulf Stream does make the waters between Greenland and North America much calmer than you might think. But during the Viking Age, nobody knew about the Gulf Stream. Furthermore, if the Vikings had settled here, they would have been much closer to other European explorers and the Native Americans, which they weren't. So if the Norsemen didn't settle in Newfoundland, or New Brunswick, or Nova Scotia, or New England, then where did they settle? Did they settle at all? Maybe Vinland was never a real place. It's always possible that the sagas got it wrong. Maybe the Norsemen never set foot in North America. Maybe it was all a dream, a hallucination, or a mistake. Maybe the sagas are 100% accurate and we're just misinterpreting them. If it is a mistake, then we need to keep looking. The search for Vinland continues today, with new expeditions going out every year hoping to find more evidence of the Norse settlement. Who knows? Maybe someday we will discover the truth about Vinland and finally put this mystery to rest. If you want to help support the channel, then please check the links below. A special thanks to those already supporting me. Thank you all so much. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. Also, remember to check out my new podcast. Thanks for watching. Bye. If you had been around 1,000 years ago, for about 2 centuries, you could have seen more stars than there are people alive today. You could have seen it because almost all of them were dead. Yep, we're back to talking about Vikings again. And since they had a knack for making really cool stuff happen right before dying horribly, this is an important story to know. Let's get into Chapter 10, Legacy of the Viking Voyages. When it comes to legacies, Vikings were not around long enough to make one. They reached their peak between roughly 750 and 1050 AD, in what scholars call the Viking Age. That puts them at about half the length of our current age, which started in 2021 when Disney released a show called Loki that featured Tom Hiddleston playing a character who goes by Loki. In case you didn't know, Loki was a trickster god in Norse mythology. just like in the show. But if you hadn't heard of him before, there's a chance you might have heard of Thor, his hammer, Mjolnir, or maybe Odin, who was also a god, but he was also known for wisdom and war strategy. All these figures came from a group of people whose influence still resonates with us today, whether we know it or not. And they're the people we usually refer to as Vikings. The word itself, Viking, means someone who goes on raids, kind of like pirates, except they weren't limited to the sea. They would also attack people on land, mostly because that's how people lived 1,000 years ago. They wouldn't just say, "Hey man, can I borrow a banana?" "No, thanks." "Well then, I guess I'll just steal it." What they did was called piracy, but they also did a lot more. They traded and explored and settled and farmed. They had kings and laws and poetry and art and even some democracy. Their culture developed alongside many others in Europe, but theirs is the one we remember most vividly, probably because it was so violent. They were fierce fighters. These guys, while they're most famous for going around and pillaging things, like we talked about in previous videos, that wasn't even their main occupation. It was actually exploration, colonization, trading and craftsmanship. So why do we remember them for the pillaging? Well, pillaging was pretty fun. We have to imagine, what else were they gonna do with all their free time? Watch Netflix? These Vikings, they went to places no one else had ever been. They made it all the way to North America, specifically to Newfoundland, Canada. We know this because in 1960, an archaeological site was discovered in Meadows that proved it. The site contained remnants of 8 buildings, including a forge, storage area, and workshop, along with tools, weapons, pottery, and animal bones. This place was used by Vikings around 500 years before Christopher Columbus got lost and found the Americas. But the Vikings didn't stop there. They went further than anyone else before them, exploring not only the coast of North America, but the coast of Greenland and Iceland too. So where did they go after that? Well, there's some debate over that. There's evidence that suggests they landed in places like Ireland, England, France, Italy, Turkey, and the Middle East, places we associate with other explorers, but not the Vikings. So what happened to them? Why don't we hear about them anymore? Why don't we hear about any of this anymore? Well, we do hear about it, just not as much as we should. Maybe it's because most of the population had died, either from warfare, famine, or disease, or maybe it's because, over time, the surviving Vikings were absorbed by the societies they raided and pillaged until their culture disappeared. Whatever the reason, we have very little left to go on. But what we do have is worth remembering. For one, it reminds us that wherever you find Vikings, you usually find sagas, stories written down about their adventures and exploits. For example, the Vinland saga tells the tale of Erik the Red, a real historical figure who settled Greenland, and his son, Leif Erikson, who discovered the first permanent settlement in North America. These stories are important because they were written by Icelandic monks who wanted to record the deeds of their heroic ancestors. The monks wrote them down in the 13th century, 200 years after the Vikings were at their peak, and they recorded the tales through an oral tradition passed down from generation to generation. We know that sounds crazy. Some dude in a monastery wrote down the story of how his buddy chopped off some dude's head, and that's how we know about it. But here's the thing, it's kind of like those chain letters you used to get in the mail. They always started out with this story about how your great-great-great-uncle accidentally killed Abraham Lincoln. Then they told you to pass the letter on to 13 friends so the curse could continue. The saga is kind of like that, except instead of killing presidents, it's about chopping heads off, and instead of passing the story on to 13 friends, they passed it on for 200 years through generations of storytellers, before finally writing it down. So with that in mind, what does the story tell us? Well, it tells us that Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red, set sail west in his father's ship, the same one that sailed to Greenland, and landed in North America after crossing the North Atlantic Ocean. And that is absolutely insane. If this story is true, then Vikings were the first Europeans to reach the New World. They beat everyone, including Christopher Columbus, who is credited with discovering the Americas. But really, he just stumbled upon them accidentally. He thought he was in India. To be fair, the Vikings didn't stay. Leif Erikson stayed for about 3 years and named the place Vinland because they saw wild grapes growing there. But after that, they all went home. However, the legacy of their journey lives on. It's kept alive by the state of Maine. which celebrates Leif Erikson Day every October, and by countless books, movies and TV shows, including The Northman, How to Train Your Dragon, and American Gods. Even one of my favorite video games, God of War, imagines a world where the gods of Norse legend are real, and their followers live among us, hiding in plain sight. In fact, we often forget that these legends are about more than just scary gods and monsters. They're about humans. They're about people just like us. People with the same hopes, dreams and fears. Take for instance, the myth of Kvasir, the wisest of the gods, who was killed by Loki, the god of mischief. Some versions of the story say that Kvasir was turned into a snake and thrown into the ocean. Other versions say he was chopped up and made into a drink. Either way, it's a sad story, but it also speaks to the human condition. No matter how smart you are, no matter how much you know, there's always something or someone out there that will try to destroy you. But we can't let that defeat us. Instead, we should keep learning, keep exploring, and keep telling stories. After all, that's what the Vikings did. They were curious about the world, and they weren't afraid to explore it. They were willing to risk everything to see what was beyond the horizon, and they brought that spirit with them wherever they went. That's why the Vikings are remembered so fondly today, because they remind us that no matter where we come from, we all have the same potential for greatness. They remind us that we can achieve anything if we just set our minds to it. So next time you feel like giving up, next time you think the world is too hard, or you're not smart enough or brave enough, remember the Vikings. Remember how they dared to explore the unknown and never stopped until they reached their destination. Remember how they faced danger head-on and never backed down from a challenge. Remember how they achieved things no one else thought possible and left behind a legacy that continues to inspire us today. Let their story be your motivation. Let their courage be your guide, and let their spirit be with you always. Thanks for watching. Click here to watch this video we did on the dangers of being a Viking, or click here to watch this video. As always, thanks for watching, and see you next time. It's time for bed. Let me tell you a story about faraway lands and people from long ago. It's the final chapter. Now, where did this story come from? It started with sagas, stories from long ago Icelanders who told tales of a faraway land called Vinland. It's a mix of myth and legend and history. Archaeologists have found clues that real people really did go to this faraway place more than 1,000 years ago. But the sagas are filled with giants and monsters, so it's hard to know what's true and what's not. So, let's imagine that the sagas are true. Let's pretend that Leif Erikson and his friends really did sail across the ocean to Vinland. They sailed away from Iceland in the year 999. After sailing for weeks on the ocean, they finally saw land. They landed at Cape Spear in Newfoundland, the easternmost point in North America. This was a huge accomplishment. When the explorers arrived in Vinland, they brought their Norse culture with them, but they also brought diseases from Europe that wiped out many Native Americans. The Norse people settled in Vinland and built a small village. The men fished for delicious fish, and the women gathered berries and other food. It sounds peaceful and pleasant, and yet there is a darkness in the sagas that suggests otherwise. In one story, the Norse people were attacked by people from farther south. These people were called Skrælings, and they may have been members of the Beothuk tribe. The Norse people fought back with their swords, but they soon realized that war with the Skrælings would be impossible. So they packed up and left. Some of them returned to Iceland, but others went farther south to Greenland, and that's the end of the story. That's how we imagine it ended. But what if the story isn't over? What if the Norse people didn't just leave Greenland and disappear? What if some of them stayed in Vinland, or went even farther south? And what if the Skrælings, the Native Americans, didn't just disappear either? What if they're still here somewhere? We don't have any written records about what happened next. But maybe there's evidence in the landscape itself. Maybe there are traces of Norse and Native American cultures all across the coast of North America. If we look carefully, if we listen closely, can we hear echoes of Vinland? Here at Meadows, there are ruins of a Norse house. The archaeologists who discovered it named it Point Rosie. Here in this house, people probably lived 1,000 years ago. Over the years, researchers have found tools and weapons and other objects that were made by people who came from Europe. These objects have been dated to the year 1000. This was the first Norse settlement in North America, and it was abandoned only a few decades later. What happened here? Why did the Norse people leave? We don't know, but we do know that they had to work hard to survive in this new land. Their farms failed because the soil wouldn't grow the crops they needed. They couldn't hunt animals like moose and deer because they had never seen such animals before. In Vinland, they had to learn new ways of living, new ways of thinking about food and farming. Maybe some of the Norse people adapted to life in Vinland. Maybe they learned to live off the land, to hunt and fish and gather food. Maybe they even learned to speak the language of the Skrallings, and maybe some Skrallings adopted Norse ways of life. Imagine children speaking both Gaelic and Norse as they ran through the forest. Imagine feasts with dishes made from both European and native ingredients. But then, after less than 100 years, the Norse settlements were abandoned. The Norse people were gone and their villages were destroyed. The only sign that they were ever here is the archaeological site at Meadows. What happened next is a mystery. Where did the Norse people go? Did they head south and find new homes on the coast of Maine or Massachusetts, or even farther south? Did they blend into other cultures, losing their distinct identity? Or did they disappear entirely, perhaps wiped out by disease or war? The Norse people weren't the only ones who disappeared. The Skrallings, the Native Americans, were also largely gone within a century. Today, there are only 2 recognized First Nations in Newfoundland, the Inuit and the Bio. Their ancestors probably spoke completely different languages, wore different clothes, and had different ways of getting food and treating sick people. But somewhere along the way, these 2 groups came together. They shared ideas and knowledge and traditions. Today, the Beothuk and the Inuit live very different lives. They live in different places and speak different languages. But when we look at the history of these cultures, we can see an echo of Vinland. We can see an echo of a time when 2 different cultures met on the coast of North America. There's one more thing that we need to talk about. There are 2 different versions of the Norse Sagas, the Icelandic Sagas and the Norwegian Sagas. The Icelandic Sagas were written down around the year 1270. The Norwegian Sagas were written down a little bit later. They have the same basic stories, but they also have important differences. In the Icelandic Sagas, the Norse people are always fighting with the Skrellings. There's one story, for example, about a man named Thorvald killed a Skralling woman. He cut her head off and threw it into the sea. Later, his boat was overturned and he drowned. And when the other explorers pulled him out of the water, they saw that his head had been cut off and thrown into the boat. The Skrallings, it seems, had gotten their revenge. In the Norwegian sagas, though, there's no story about Thorvald. Instead, there's a story about a man named Thorgest. Thorgest was captured by the Skrallings and taken to their village. There he met the chief's daughter. She liked Thorgest and wanted to marry him. When Thorgest refused, she tricked him and stabbed him in the leg. Then he knew that he would never be able to return to Norway, so he stayed in Vinland and farmed the land. Which version is true, if either is up to you to decide. But I want to focus on something else. Both versions of the sagas say that Thorgest never returned to Norway. He stayed in Vinland and lived out the rest of his days as a farmer. If Thorgest stayed in Vinland, he wasn't the only one. Maybe some of the other Norse people stayed too. Maybe they decided that this new land was worth exploring, worth trying to make a home in. And maybe they weren't the only ones. Maybe some of the Skrallings decided to stay too, to explore the possibilities of this new world. This new world that had been opened up by the Norse. When we read stories like this, it's easy to think of the explorers as heroes. They set out into the unknown, braving dangerous waters and wild creatures, and they discover new lands and new peoples. But these stories are also full of violence and death. Explorers bring disease to new lands. They fight and kill the people who live there. They take resources and land and power. The story of Vinland teaches us about all of this. It teaches us about the bravery and curiosity of the explorers, but also about the darkness of colonialism and the lasting impact that exploration has on everyone involved. And now it's time to close this chapter. We've come to the end of our story, but what does it mean? What lessons can we learn from the saga of Vinland? One lesson might be that exploring new lands and meeting new people can be scary, but it can also be an incredible opportunity for learning and growth. The Norse people and the Skrallings had very different ways of living, but they could have learned from each other and created something new. Another lesson is that when explorers travel to new lands, they should be respectful of the people and the environment. The Norse people didn't know anything about the plants and animals in Vinland, and they didn't understand the land they were on. This led to a lot of problems for them. If they had taken the time to learn about Vinland and its people, things might have been different. The story of Vinland is a story about adventure and discovery, but it's also a story about mystery and loss. We may never know exactly what happened in Vinland, but we can learn from the mistakes of the past and work towards a better future. So that's the end of our story. It's time to go. But before we do, I want you to remember this. Even though the Norse people are gone, their story isn't. Their story is part of the story of this land, part of the story of Canada, and it's up to us to keep their story alive. Thank you for listening. Now it's time for bed. Sweet dreams. Well, hey there. Welcome to the next sleep-friendly recap, where we're going to take a look at Chapter 12 of the history of Scandinavia. Let's jump in. Chapter 12 is called The First Europeans, and it asks about the Vikings' voyages to North America and their discovery of Vinland. Now this chapter starts off with the author telling us that he is going to be taking a different approach with this section of the book, saying that he wants to tell the story slowly and calmly and in simple terms. He also tells us that what follows is an old story, a story that was already being told when Adam from Bremen was writing his book in the 13th century, but that it's a story that many people still don't know today. So he's going to take his time to make sure that we understand everything. And so, for the next few pages, he's going to go into detail explaining how the Viking ships were made, how they used them to travel across the sea and eventually make landfall in North America. As always, if you're watching this on another platform, welcome to my channel where we specialize in crash courses and recaps on all kinds of stuff. You can find the link to this book down below, as well as a full playlist for our entire series. Also, please remember to leave your support if you enjoy what we do. We are currently working on getting our own merch store up and running. But until then, any support really helps us out, and it helps us keep making these videos. But enough self-promotion, let's get back to the video. Okay, so now we've got some new information. Did you know that according to research conducted by a scientist at a university, it seems that ancient Vikings were more than just raiders? Yep, it turns out that only about 4% of all Viking raids were actually against the English. The rest were against fellow Scandinavian countries, or even further away, along the coast of Africa. Okay, that makes sense. There is no way that those guys would have wanted to sail all the way over here just to pillage a couple monasteries. No, that was just an added bonus. They were actually explorers and traders. Well, okay, maybe not exactly traders, because it turns out most of their goods were looted or stolen, but they were exploring and trading in their own ways, apparently. And speaking of exploring, it's at this point in the chapter that Axel Santos takes us back to around the year 800 AD. This is right after the time period that we talked about in Chapter 7, when Ragnar Lothbrok was sailing around trying to find land beyond the sunset. According to legend, it was during one of these voyages that Ragnar came across an island that would become known as the Isle of the Evening Sun. Okay, yes, I realize that we've been calling it Vinland this whole time, and I assure you, that is coming up. But the name Vinland was actually given to this area by the Irish monks who had settled on the island. When the Vikings showed up, they took one look at all the wild grapes growing there and decided to rename it the Isle of the Evening Sun because, well, the sun sets in the evening. You know, that's what they called it, because they were classy. Anyway, before long, more and more Vikings started showing up on the island, and they seemed to be coming from a place that was very far away. According to the sagas, the people who lived there had white skin, dark hair, and were Christian. They also seemed to be peaceful people who didn't want anything to do with the Vikings. So the Vikings either killed them or enslaved them. Yep, I guess those peaceful Vikings weren't so peaceful after all. So it was around this time that a man named Floke went to the Isle of the Evening Sun and tried to set up a settlement. But within 3 years, everyone had either died or gone insane, which is basically the polite way of saying they all ran away and never looked back. Still, over the next few decades, 7 more attempts were made to settle the island, but each and every single one of them failed. Apparently, it's not that easy to start a settlement in North America. Who knew? But according to the sagas, the Vikings weren't done with this place yet. For hundreds of years afterward, Norsemen would continue to sail over and raid the island. Maybe they couldn't establish a settlement here, but they could definitely ruin everyone's day. So for the next few centuries, the history of Vinland is pretty spotty. We have almost no written records from this time period at all, and so the Icelandic sagas are our best source of information. They say that the Vikings continued to attack the island, but they also mention a guy named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who actually managed to live in peace with the natives. Supposedly, he even became friends with one of their chiefs and traded with him, and he wasn't the only one. For a while, there was actually a bit of peace between the Vikings and the locals. The sagas talk about huge trade networks being established, but as usual, those networks didn't last long. Eventually, the violence started up again, and everyone began killing everyone else. According to the sagas, the last recorded attack on the island happened in 1194, when a fleet of 30 ships showed up carrying 3,000 men. Now, this was right around the time that Christianity started becoming popular in Scandinavia, and the sagas implied that these Vikings were attacking the island in part because they wanted to convert the natives to Christianity. Yeah, let's just ignore the fact that they spent the last 200 years killing everyone on the island. Let's just try and be nice to them now. I guess that's kind of the point of the story. Like, obviously, this isn't a real account of history. It's a story meant to show us the difference between good and evil. Obviously, the Vikings are supposed to be the bad guys here, right? That's what the author wants us to think. But like I said, this is an old story. This is one that had already been passed down through generations of Icelanders by the time Adam from Bremen was writing his book in the 13th century. By that point, the original story had probably changed quite a bit. Who knows what the actual history of Vinland was like? All we have are the sagas and other written records from a few hundred years later. Still, though, this was an important story to the people of Iceland, and so Adam from Bremen included it in his work. He wanted his audience to know about the atrocities committed by those evil Vikings, but he also wanted them to know that the Vikings had changed. Now, this was a common theme among Northern European writers during this time period. They all wanted to present their countries as being Christian and peaceful, even though they weren't. Now, before we wrap up this video, I want to leave you with one final thought. As Adam from Bremen saw it, this story started as an oral tradition, something that was told around the dinner table and around the campfire. It was a story that was kept alive in the memories of the people long before it was ever written down. And as we've seen, stories are powerful things. They shape the way that we see the world. They help us make sense of the past, and in some cases, they can even inspire us to be better people. Of course, stories can also be used for nefarious purposes, but that's a topic for another video. Right now, all I want to do is close by saying that stories are the foundation of history. They are the building blocks that we use to construct the past. And sometimes, just sometimes, a story can even outlive the event that inspired it. Vinland is a great example of this. Even though the Norse settlements in North America only lasted a couple hundred years, the stories about them lived on for centuries, even after the places that inspired them were forgotten. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button. It really does help us out. Leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts about this book or about Norse exploration in general. And as always, subscribe if you want to be notified whenever we post a new video. But until then, goodbye.